Stand by SOT1.
Standing.
10 seconds. Ready, rollin'. Ready, SOT1.
Ready.
In 4, 3, 2, 1. Roll in.
From legendary Uncle Studios in beautiful Southern California, welcome to another edition of Work Comp Matters, the central location for you employees, you employers, and of course, we haven't forgotten about you damn independent contractors. And now, here's this week's edition of Work Comp Matters. It is January 31st. About a minute after 12 noon Pacific Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of Work Comp Matters. We are sponsored by mancavepodcasting.com. If you want to do your own podcast, all you have to do is talk anywhere in the world. All you need is a smartphone or a computer. Mancavepodcasting.com will produce, direct, manage, stream your podcast live, put it into the cloud forever, all for one low fee. And if you're a little short of change, mancavepodcasting.com has over 600, almost 700 podcasts in the tank. They're completely free, no obligation, available to you 24/7. All you have to do is click a button. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Appel. I'm joined by the madman across the water, the socialist voice of reason out in Munich, Germany, Mr. John Scalia. John and I bring you stories today that we believe affect and are of interest to you California employees, employers, and of course, we haven't forgotten about you damn independent contractors. Stories in the news today. Colleges struggle to recruit therapists for students in crisis. Deadline looms today for single-payer health care bill. San Francisco residents who got the J&J shot. And by the way, I got my J&J one and done April 1, Pierce College, San Fernando Valley last year. San Francisco residents who got their J&J shot can now get a third shot. You will not see me in that line anytime soon. Los Angeles Times. Los Angeles County daily coronavirus cases continue dramatic decline, but death rates remain high. Optimism at Los Angeles County nursing homes as coronavirus surge declines. How prevalent is Omicron? Backlog, selective testing, reveal incomplete picture. How will the winter surge change the path of the pandemic? Should we be worried? The latest COVID variant is 1.5 times more contagious than Omicron and already circulating in almost half of the states. Studies show Omicron variant less severe, but causes more reinfections. 5 numbers that show the incredible toll COVID has exacted in the latest in 2 years. Those stories plus more on Work Comp Matters. But I want to start with a story from the Los Angeles Times that John and I were briefly talking about, and John just brought it up to my attention a couple of minutes ago in pre-show. This has to do with Joe Rogan, Spotify, and Neil Young. This is from the Los Angeles Times. Joe Rogan responds to Spotify misinformation controversy. Popular Spotify podcaster Joe Rogan last night, responded to allegations of misinformation on his audio programming, pledging to do a better job of balancing different perspectives and putting more time into researching topics. Really? He's been pretty selective in his opinions in the past year that the vaccines really are not that, I'm going to paraphrase now, that the vaccines are not that important. There are some type of conspiracy theories, and don't listen to 95% of all of the medical experts that are out there. Actually, don't listen to 98% of the medical experts are there. He has his one medical expert, I forgot the name of it, but listen to him because he knows better. Continuing on. Quote, I'm going to do my best, but my point of doing this is always just to create interesting conversations and ones that I hope people enjoy, close quote. Rogan said in a 9-minute video statement released on Spotify and his Instagram page, quote, so if I piss you off, I'm sorry. And if you enjoyed the podcast, thank you, close quote. Of course, this comes after a couple of days when Neil Young came out and followed by Joni Mitchell that said Neil Young and Joni Mitchell are tired of the misinformation regarding vaccines. And Neil Young insisted that Spotify remove, and apparently Spotify complied. Why they did, I'm not sure. Spotify complied and removed all Neil Young songs from their playlist. I don't know if Joni Mitchell's request for the same has been complied with. Now, it's also worth noting that earlier this year, Neil Young sold the rights to 50% of his music to a Singapore company. I forgot the name. I didn't write it down. I didn't prepare it. But this deal is said to be worth about $150 million. Warner Brothers Entertainment, Warner Brothers, apparently owns the other 50%. Neil Young sold 50% to the Singapore company earlier this year for $150 million. And it appears on Friday, post Neil Young's statement or demand that Spotify remove all of it. Spotify's net worth on the stock exchange went down over $2 billion. $2 billion. Now, of course, Spotify can make it back up if the stock price goes up. It probably will. I see Spotify as a very good investment. In fact, I see Spotify as an excellent investment, but don't come to me for financial or investment advice. I admit complete and total ignorance, okay? But that being said, I wanted to talk a little more about this topic, and here we go. Joe Rogan defended himself Sunday, but vowed to try harder to offer more balance on his podcast for his first public response to the growing protest facing over COVID-19 misinformation. Rogan's comments came after the streaming service announced it would add a content advisory to any podcast episode that discusses the coronavirus. The move came after several musicians, led by Neil Young, said they were pulling their music from the platform over its failure to take action against the spread of falsehoods about vaccines. Its star podcaster, and now referring to Joe Rogan, who signed a $100 million deal last year with Spotify, giving the streaming service exclusive rights to his show. Well, it says here 2020. I thought it was last year, but we'll go with that. Has been at the center of his growing backlash. Rogan responded in a 10-minute video posted to Instagram. He said he would do his best to make sure he's researched all of these topics and try harder to get people with different opinions on his show, which reaches an estimated 11 million listeners per episode. Okay. Well, Joe Rogan's been doing this for a year. Why all of a sudden now is Rogan coming out with a 10-minute speech saying he's going to be more concerned and he's going to try and air more views and he's going to try and get people from all angles to talk about, amongst other things, COVID-19 and the vaccine. This has been going on for a friggin' year. I'll tell you why. Because of money. Okay? Spotify just lost $2 billion in revenue. You think that has anything whatsoever to with Rogan coming out? And by the way, Rogan didn't apologize. He said he's going to give more people an opportunity to come on the show and give their point of view. He's going to do more research. Really, Joe? You mean you've been talking about COVID-19 and vaccine for a year and you haven't done enough research? What the hell is up with that? Now, Neil Young, and Neil Young is one of the few entertainers, and Scott from Uncle Studio can verify that, but Scott never talks on the show. Neil Young is one of the few entertainers that has been around for 7 decades. Yeah, that's right. Neil Young falls into the category of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. Not to say that he's as popular or as wealthy. He certainly isn't. But, well, he's probably pretty much there with Bob Dylan, but not with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, that came out in the 60s and have still been popular through today. That is 7 decades of rock and roll, classic rock music. And, Neil Young coming out and saying, remove all my stuff from Spotify, $150 million, whatever the case may be. And that's because Neil Young did that deal with that Singapore company worth about $150 million. But when you're on a social media platform such as Spotify and Neil Young comes out and says, remove all my stuff, and within 24, 48 hours, Spotify loses $2.1 million in revenue. Trust me.
Billion.
Sorry?
Billion.
A billion. Yes, that's right. Spotify lost $2.1 billion in revenue 24, 48 hours after I call it the Neil Young controversy. People at Spotify, the higher ups, the bean counters, the widget counters, they're going to take notice. Now, will Spotify make it back? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, again, I'm no marketing stock market, but I mean, this is like $1.50 revenue, whatever. Believe me, it'll pick back up. But people stand up and take notice when you take a $2 billion hit. And I will close with this. I only hope that one day Work Comp Matters, mancavepodcasting.com, Steve Appel is making enough money where I can take a $2 billion hit. I would love to be in a position to take a $2 billion hit. I would probably sell everything to John Scalia at a 50% discount and let him run the damn company. Okay? And with that being said, that's the end of my rant. We'll give John a chance to respond after the break. I want to thank Joe Rogan, Neil Young, and Spotify, and John Scalia for giving me the current event to talk about and rant on the first half of Work Comp Matters. You are dialed in. It's January 31st, and it's a pleasure to have you here on Work Comp Matters. Of course, we're sponsored by mancavepodcasting.com. If you want to do your own podcast, all you have to do is talk 818-357-4120. And if you just want to listen, we've got over 600, almost 700 shows in the cloud. They're completely free, no obligation. And thanks for joining in. And now I'm going to give John ample opportunity to respond to my opening rant.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the reasons for what happened. Clearly, no matter how big a corporation you are, a $2 billion hit is huge. And when you realize that probably your main contributor is a good portion, if not all, the reason for the $2 billion hit, you probably send him a memo that says, would you like to backtrack a little so that we can try to recoup these losses and pay
Yeah,
you?
it's sort of like get on your knees. Go ahead, John.
Obviously, they didn't make him get on his knees. All he said was, I'm going to do a better job of research. So, naturally, I did my usual thing, which is to Google Joe Rogan's education. And he's a proud high school graduate, which means he's not qualified to talk about anything regarding vaccines, epidemiology, infections, whatever. I'm not qualified to talk, and I've cross-examined maybe 1,000 doctors. So he's basically saying, well, gee, you actually want me to read something? I'm only a high school graduate. What do you want? Now, personally, I've only listened to one Joe Rogan show, and it was about not taking the vaccine. I forget. Well, the reason was he had Dr. Sanjay Gupta on, believe it or not, who's the main medical correspondent for CNN. That's why I tuned into that episode of Rogan to see what he and Gupta were talking about. And I don't know what Gupta was thinking, because he didn't get Rogan to change anything. And Rogan, in fact, seemed halfway reasonable. I mean, he said, well, I've had COVID, and the reason I didn't get vaccinated was because I'm healthy, I don't have any comorbidities, and I didn't figure it would be that big a deal for me. All of which, personally, I think is somewhat reasonable. Not a reason to tell people not to take the vaccine. Now, I am old enough to remember the polio vaccine coming out. I'm 75. And believe you me, everybody knew people who were getting polio. We were all scared stiff. And when the vaccine came out, believe me, you could not get to your doctor's office quickly enough to get that vaccine. And we all got it. And as we know, polio has virtually disappeared from the world. Unfortunately, we can't do that with COVID. So, it's clear that vaccines do their job generally. And the risk on getting a vaccine is very minimal. And so, spreading misinformation and making people afraid to get a vaccine is just irresponsible. Steve.
Yeah. And John, as you were speaking, I was just looking up Neil Young and polio. And Neil Young had many surgery. My understanding is Neil Young had many surgeries growing up before he became the famous Neil Young that I've thoroughly enjoyed his music. He had many surgeries to overcome what polio did to him. I'm sorry that I did not research it properly, but I know that it says here Young was one of the beneficiaries of polio vaccine. As he wrote on his website, I was vaccinated for polio at my school in Canada. Nothing new about vaccines. They have been there for a long time, like me, just like you said, John. And my understanding is when Neil Young was a child, he had many surgeries. I'm not entirely sure if it's because of polio and or a combination of polio and some type of spina bifida. But Neil Young had many back spinal surgeries as a child. So clearly it's an issue that he is very sensitive about.
And well, he should be. And the good news for him was, being in Canada, all those multiple surgeries didn't cost him or his parents a dime.
I knew you would throw that in, John. Yeah, but go ahead, John. You can either follow up on that, or we can just get to the news. We've got like 8 minutes left.
Okay, first story is colleges struggle to recruit therapists for students in crisis. Early in his first quarter at the University of California, Davis, Ryan Manriquez realized he needed help. A combination of pressures: avoiding COVID-19, enduring a breakup, dealing with a disability, trying to keep up with a tough slate of classes, hit him hard. I felt the impact right away. After learning of UC Davis's free counseling services, Manriquez showed up at the Student Health Center and lined up an emergency Zoom session the same day. He was referred to other resources within days and eventually settled into weekly group therapy. Now he's the president of the student union. Okay, now I'm going to skip down because later on in the They're going to talk about my alma mater back here. If I get to Santa Clara, here we go. Tatiana Foltz, a licensed clinical social worker in San Jose, California, spent 3 years as a mental health services case manager at Santa Clara University. I absolutely enjoyed working with the college students. They're intelligent, dynamic, and complex, and they are working things out, Foltz said. But she left the university a few years ago, lured by the flexibility of private practice and frustrated by a campus system that Foltz felt did not reflect the diverse needs of its students. Foltz returned to campus in December to support Santa Clara students as they protested what they said were inadequate services on campus, including insufficient numbers of diverse counselors representing Black, Indigenous, and LGBTQ plus communities and other people of color. The protests followed the deaths of 3 students during the fall quarter, 2 by suicide. The Board of Trustees pledged several $1 million in new funding for campus counseling. I would point out Santa Clara is a private and well-to-do institution. It's interesting, it is a Jesuit Catholic institution, and you will note that part of the reason for the protests was that they needed counseling not only for Black students, Indigenous students, but LGBTQ, who are not generally favored by the Catholic Church. But that would get into a whole different screed about Jesuit education and Catholic education. But it's an interesting article. It points out that, again, money is part of the problem because it lures people away from campus counseling into private practice. Steve.
Continuing on with Neil Young, but John, you can take the stories of the day. In his memoir, Waging Heavy Peace, Neil Young remembers being about 5 years old in 1951 and his parents rushing him to Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. And it was hard for him to walk for some reason. A painful lumbar puncture that hurt like hell and scared him to death revealed what his doctors feared. Neil Young had polio. The disease had ravaged his body, and his brother Bob Young recalls a lengthy hospitalization after which Neil had to relearn how to walk. Remembers him trying to get from one part of the living room to another by hanging on to furniture to keep his balance, Bob Young said. He was unsure of what happened with his battle with polio. And Young felt the wages of polio well into his adulthood. Lower back vertebrae were surgically removed, and he frequently wore a back brace, even during concerts. After some time growing up in a rural area outside of Toronto, Young and his family settled in another area, and he literally had to learn to walk again, where he faced another painful event, the slow deterioration of his parents' marriage. John.
The latest COVID variant is 1.5 times more contagious than Omicron and already circulating in almost half of U.S. states. There are already dozens of cases across almost half of the U.S. of a new COVID subvariant that's even more contagious than the already highly transmissible Omicron variant. Nearly half of U.S. states have confirmed the presence of BA2 with at least 127 known cases nationwide as of Friday, according to a global database that tracks COVID variants. The subvariant is 1.5 times more transmissible than the original strain, referred to by scientists as BA+1. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but I am really tired of hearing about all this. Apparently we're never going to get rid of it. So we're going to have to learn to live with it, really. That means we get vaccinated and we do what we can. And in Munich, we all wear masks indoors and we try to maintain social distancing. But still, really? This one's known as BA2. I suspect the next variant will be known as BS1. Steve.
Ha, 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 ha. When Neil Young was a child, he was not only diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, but Neil Young also suffered from epilepsy. While likely not his first seizure, one such episode in 1967 remains memorable. He was hanging out at a radio festival called the Hollywood Teen Flare, when he suddenly found himself on his back on the pavement, and he continued to have occasional seizures into the 70s. He told Rolling Stone in 1975 that he had never had one while performing because he always left the stage when he could feel one coming on. However, in 2012, he told National Public Radio, they don't happen anymore. He thinks he's outgrown them. I know people that have epilepsy. I didn't know you can outgrow it, but it is what it is. Who am I to argue with Neil Young? Go ahead, John.
I wasn't planning on reading this article because I hadn't really seen it. But anyway, it's on the Theranos trial. Legal experts agree Elizabeth Holmes is bound for prison, but for how long? Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes' fraud conviction has raised two big questions. Will she go to prison? And if so, for how long? Holmes faces up to 80 years behind bars and $1 million fine after her conviction on one count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and 3 counts of wire fraud related to defrauding investors. Each count carries a maximum sentence of 20 years and a $250,000 fine. Legal experts agree Holmes is headed for a cell. Judges' broad discretion in federal sentencing guidelines make consecutive sentences rare. And it goes on, it says, as a mother, it says she may get sympathy for having a baby. So I just have a very simple question for you. If Elizabeth Holmes were not pretty, white, and an ex-Stanford graduate, but instead a black woman who was poor, do you think that anybody would care and that you would get consideration for a lighter sentence? Steve.
That, John, is an excellent question, and I think I'm going to attempt to answer it during another show. Do you have any closing thoughts or burning desires?
Yeah, I did have an article that I didn't read that was about conflicting opinions on whether marijuana damages the brain in any perceptible way. And it was dealing with very young people who smoke marijuana, and I take it somewhat regularly. I will say when you're an adult, I think that any evidence that marijuana is dangerous is apocryphal. They were talking about cognitive functions. I remember in Vienna when I used to smoke hash, not regularly, but occasionally, I actually forgot that I had an exam and I'd gotten high on hash and I went, oh my God, I've got an exam. And I ran out of the bar where I was living because our classrooms were basically across the street. And I sat and took a German exam when I was high on hash. I got a good grade, actually.
All right, John. Well, thank you very much for that. And that takes us to the end of the show. Smoking hash is a good way to end the show always. Thank you all very much for joining another edition of Work Comp Matters. I want to give much thanks to Scott Walton of legendary Uncle Studio, John Scalia out in Munich, Germany, all the good people back at mancavepodcasting.com. My name is Steve Appel. We'll see you again Friday, 12 noon live for another edition of Work Comp Matters. Take care, everybody.